Welcome to Institute for Government. My name is Peter Riddle. I'm the director here. For those who've braved the tube strike and the challenges of that, I'm pretty delighted to see a former permanent secretary in the Department of Transport, but I won't hold him directly to account for the tube strike. This is the first in a series of events in our broad umbrella of government and the economy, and in particular to discuss industrial strategy, where this is a series which is sponsored by the City of London Corporation, who we worked with last year on some events on parallel themes, which were extremely successful. And we're delighted the City Corporation is backing us again. We're going to have two public events, also two round tables, to look at the issues of government economy. And we're particularly glad, and it's very topical, and I'm very glad Vince Cable's been able to spare the time to kick off the series tonight. I mean, this meeting is going to be slightly abbreviated because of the Secretary of State's timetable, so we'll be going on to 7, and we can't go on longer than that. We're starting with a premise that there's been renewed interest in industrial strategy across the political spectrum recently. It's raised issues about how government should be organised. It's fine to say industrial strategy, but some very interesting issues of organisation there, both within government itself, relations with the private sector, what instruments should be used. And obviously it raises a broader debate, which will no doubt come out in questioning on that. And also there are a number of current issues. I say Vince Cable, one of the most original thinkers within government on the economy and industrial policy, will kick off the discussion. Then to my right is Richard Parry-Jones, who's co-chair of the Automotive Council, and he's been very much a very successful sector. And I couldn't have said that 20 years ago, but the automotive sector is now one of the most successful in the UK. He's been working on with the government on industrial strategy for the sector, and of course the massive and wide implications of skills, of suppliers, and so on. And he'll be telling us what he's looked and learnt. Then Dr. Ian O'Sullivan is Director of the Centre for Science, Technology and Innovation Policy at the Institute for Manufacturing at Cambridge. We're very glad that the IFG is going to be working with the centre in the future. I won't go into his detailed CV, but he's been very involved in looking at these issues, and particularly international examples, which is we're very keen on the Institute always to look at what happens within industrial strategy elsewhere. So that's the broad parameters of the discussion. Vince Cable is going to kick off the discussion, then I'll bring in Richard Parry-Jones and then Ian O'Sullivan, and then we'll have a brief discussion amongst ourselves, and then I'll open it up in that time limit. Vince.
Well, thanks, Peter. I mean, the question I was invited to address, which was why government finds it hard to operate in the long term and how in practice we can try to counter that. I mean, on a personal level, getting into government for me was something of a culture shock. I'd come out of a company where we had 20-year planning horizons, and some of the really big projects, like Norwegian gas fields, were being planned over a 40 to 50-year time horizon. And you get into government where 5 years is heroically long term, and it's a very different kind of decision-making environment. So what are the factors that make long-term thinking and planning difficult? Well, first there's the political cycle. And at the moment, we're in an extraordinary long-termist phase of government where we have fixed parliaments, which is quite a constitutional novelty. And I've discovered I've now been in my job for longer than any of my predecessors since Peter Thornycroft in the 1950s. Most of my predecessors were there for, often as little as a year, which when having done this job is utterly preposterous. I've begun to feel I was getting on top of it after 2 to 3 years. And that goes for most of the other senior jobs in government. So the political cycle is one. Secondly, many of the institutional arrangements in the private sector are geared to short-term thinking. That shouldn't be like that. I mean, the Companies Act legislation builds in the long-term interests of shareholders. But what we have found, and was exposed in the work of the Kay Commission that I set up shortly after getting into office on long-termism, is the fiduciary duty of people running financial institutions, which they interpret very much in terms of short-term returns to their clients. And I've currently got a piece of work out with the Law Commission trying to establish whether that duty has to be cast in the rather short-term in which it often operates. And this is, it's a very arcane piece of work, but it's absolutely crucial to some very topical issues. I mean, I don't want to get into a discussion on this current takeover, but very much at the heart of it is how the shareholders and their representatives interpret the fiduciary duty. Similarly, the allocation of shares in the Royal Mail, which has become a major cause célèbre, centres very much on that issue. So short-termism in financial institutions. Thirdly, pressures on particular issues. I mean, a good example is the energy sector. As I came out of an energy company where we thought very long-term. If you're in the business of power generation, you're between nuclear power, you're thinking 50 years ahead. If you're just doing a conventional gas-powered station, you probably have to think a decade, 2 decades ahead. But the pressures on decision-making about price, as we all know from the current debate, very much geared to short-term economic circumstances, squeezes on living standards. I mean, they're very legitimate concerns, but they're very, very different time horizons from the kind of people who plan future power stations. And then fourthly, you know, stuff happens, you know, we've just been through an epic financial crisis, which wasn't widely anticipated, has done enormous damage, and changed many of the assumptions on which business decisions have been made. So for all those reasons, it's actually quite difficult to have a long-term approach in government. But nonetheless, we've taken the view that it is desirable from a public policy point of view to have a long-term approach which we characterize as the industrial strategy. And it has several basic premises. One is that large sectors of the economy do need to have long-term planning that go beyond the political cycle. Some of our key industries, aerospace, automotive sector, you know, energy supply chains, the energy itself, pharmaceuticals, and so on. And we need in government to create a framework within which we can look at those things coherently and sensibly. Secondly, the other key thought in the industrial strategy is that we need to have a collaborative approach between business and government. Not government control. We're not going back to the mid-1970s. We're not into centralized dirigiste planning, but equally, for many of the sectors of our economy, a pure laissez-faire approach is not helpful and sensible. So partnership captures the recognition that there are big externalities, there are big market failures that government has to address, and do so in partnership with business. And the third element in the industrial strategy is cross-government. You know, governments notoriously operate in silos. I mean, you know, we do our best, but, you know, we have our departments, there are territorial interests, every organisation has that problem. But we are trying through the industrial strategy to tie things together, to try to make sure that, say, when the Ministry of Transport has a commissioning system for railways, that this is compatible with the kind of things we're doing in BIS and long-term training and planning of innovation in the sector. So that kind of cross-departmental work. Well, I think a lot of people were very sceptical when we launched this industrial strategy about 3 years ago, that it was just words. I think it'll be a long time before people can look back and say whether this has been worthwhile or successful, but I think already there are some very good tangible products coming out of it. I'll just give several in particular. I think within the aerospace sector, where there was a steady erosion of the British share in Airbus, for example, the losing of supply chains, they now have the confidence as a result of our establishing what we call an Aerospace Technology Institute, which is a $2 billion joint funding between government and the private sector on the next generation of wing technologies. Keeps us ahead of what's happening in France, Germany, enables the British to have a much stronger bargaining power within the aerospace sector. I think there's a recognition that we've done good. Secondly, and we'll hear more about this in the panel discussion later, about the car industry or the vehicle industry more generally. One of our success stories in recent years, I mean, some of it goes back to my predecessor who set up the Automotive Council, and I think we built on that. And one particular activity is what we call the Advanced Propulsion Centre, which is a project on the next generation of engines, low-carbon engines, and the various bits of the car industry, and indeed buses and trucks, pooling their technological expertise to develop the next generation of engines. Thirdly, working to develop energy supply chains. Fairly early on, I'd realised that companies like Dong, that have invested heavily in wind power, had a UK content in their wind farms of about 20%. So we called them in and said, look, you know, this isn't great. You know, we are an open economy and we believe in free trade, but you know, have you seriously tried to procure from British suppliers? And they hadn't really. And you know, there was no coercion, but as a result of trying to work with them strategically, we've now got a supply chain being developed in offshore wind. And a good example of that was the landing of the Siemens project in Hull. It was a product of some years' work negotiating with them, but we're now beginning to get turbine manufacture and other elements of the supply chain being built up. The same thing is happening in nuclear, where one of the elements of commitment in the new EDF project will be 50% UK content. It's not mandatory, but there is strong pressure on the contractor to deliver that. Another example is the work we did on railway. The wake-up call we really had for the industrial strategy was around the Bombardier project in Derby. Actually, the correct decision was made. It was something we inherited, but it was a perfectly legitimate, sensible form of public procurement, which Siemens happened to win against Bombardier. But nonetheless, the question was asked, when we procure our new engines for the railways, do we think strategically about the supply chain? And the answer was no. The traditional public service mechanism was about value for money in a very narrow sense. So the Department of Transport have responded to that, thinking more strategically, planning 10, 20 years ahead, developing a supply chain. Bombardier, I wouldn't say it's a direct cause and effect, but Bombardier now have a secure business. Hitachi have been attracted to come here because they see a supply chain evolving. They put their headquarters here for Europe, and on the back of the rail revolution that's now happening, you have substantial UK manufacturing. I would put all those down as, in varying degrees, a consequence of the industrial strategy we've developed. So to conclude, what are the long-term issues? What are the market externalities that we're trying to address through the industrial strategy? Things that do require long-term planning. One is skills. Most of the sectors I've talked about have chronic skill shortages. Most of these problems are not going to be dealt with overnight. To get a trained engineer, from persuading a 12-year-old girl that instead of becoming a doctor, she'd think of becoming an engineer, to actually becoming a fully qualified engineer and working in a factory or whatever, is a decade. And so there's a cultural task that we're now embarked upon. Even relatively short-term vocational requirements through our advanced apprenticeship scheme probably have a time horizon of 4 to 5 years. So there is a long-term planning exercise which we're doing. A classic example of where I think we're beginning to change the mentality is in the construction industry, which is, I've realised this when we got the construction industry sector together under the industrial strategy. It's very fragmented. Britain is way behind many other countries in terms of its technology compared with Sweden or Finland. And a very, very cyclical approach to training. Well, that may always happen, but I think they've now recognised collectively that they have a problem, and it's now manifesting itself as we move out of recession. And so we are now beginning to embed some long-term planning for the construction sector. So skills, 1. 2, innovation, and Lord Sainsbury did great work in government to build up our science and innovation capacity, but we've tried to improve the structure of it through these so-called catapult centres, which are again, are designed to take a long-term view on key technologies that have industrial application. And I think the work that's now been developed through the Advanced Manufacturing Catapult, cell therapy for medicine, the new renewable technologies that have been developed in Glasgow, and we now have 8 of these now which are up and running in different technological areas. I think a third area, public procurement. Again, different departments have bought into this with varying degrees of enthusiasm. It's been more difficult to get defence committed to thinking industrially. For very understandable reasons, not a criticism of the minister or the department. They've got to make cuts, they've got to cut their budget, it was inflated, so there is a much more aggressive approach to costs. It's often easier to buy off the shelf. So getting them integrated into the process is difficult, but it is actually happening. And I think lastly and crucially, actually access to finance. We have this very long-standing problem for small, medium-sized companies of how do they raise long-term patient capital? If you're a medium-sized company and you want to get equity investment, for a 10-year, a solid long-term investor, how do you develop institutions that enable you to get that? Similarly with loan finance. And I think with the combination of the business bank and the private sector fund, which has been established by the banking system, we're beginning to develop embryonic systems of funding business on a much longer term basis. The big gap in the market, and I think we're beginning to address that. So I'm sorry to be a little long-winded, but I hope that covers at least some of the ground.
Indeed, thank you very much indeed for that. A whole series of questions raised, which we'll only be able to cover some. Now, looking at a particular sector, you've seen that from a particular sector. What's your view, and taking it forward, because Vince singled out the automotive sector, which has seen massive transformations. So how does the strategy fit with what you're doing, Richard?
Well, we have a very valuable relationship with government, and I would argue that all countries have an industrial strategy. Because essentially it's the sum of what everybody does in this space. And some of them are strategies of neglect, some of them are strategies of antithesis, and some are very carefully designed and supported strategies of growth. Fortunately, we've transitioned in the UK towards the latter, which is where we now are. Where we have been, and particularly the automotive sector, when I first got involved in this after my sort of extensive executive career at Ford Motor Company, we had been experienced in the UK 2.5 decades of continuous decline, hollowing out. And actually it was quite a dangerous situation, because if you read the sort of reports about the industry, on the surface it didn't look so bad, because we were still assembling a reasonable volume of cars. It was just over 1 million a year. But what was hidden underneath that rather promising headline was a very serious erosion of capability. An erosion of R&D, a rapid decline in the face of industrial competitors abroad investing and increasing R&D, and hollowing out of the supply chain. Yes, we still had 19 of the global suppliers here in the UK, but what were they doing here? What they were doing was importing clever parts designed elsewhere and screwdriver assembling them just in time, in sequence with the assembly demands of the assembly line for the OEM. We were losing 10,000 jobs a year, and had been losing 10,000 jobs a year for 15 years. Now, some of that loss of jobs, of course, is inevitable. It's called productivity, producing the same number of cars with fewer people. But a good deal of it was also lost value add from the UK. So we decided that we were invited actually by the previous government to look at this situation. And I was asked to chair a body called the NAIGT to look at this. And we reported back after about 15 months with an analysis, understanding the diagnostics, the root causes of those declines, and suggesting a way forward. And one of the key changes was we did a lot of benchmarking. We compared the way in which governments and industrial sectors work together, because they have codependencies, whether they like them or not, and whether they design them to be mutually supportive or not. They are inevitably highly codependent. And we compared how the UK was performing in this regard with how other industrial countries, who are essentially our economic competitors in the global market, were doing the same thing. And the answer essentially was that in many other countries there was a great deal of collaboration, communication and co-design of positive outcomes for all the stakeholders. And in the UK there was a mixture, actually it's a little bit schizophrenic. It was a mixture of sort of neglect and occasional panicked intervention when a crisis emerged. And usually by that time the patient involved was terminally ill, but it didn't stop certain governments putting lots of the taxpayers' money in trying to revive them. So actually we concluded that the better approach was to have a strategic partnership. So we had an ongoing dialogue. We created a common framework around which we could work together, create the conditions in which it would be attractive for investors in the automotive industry. They've got choices. They can invest anywhere in the world. We need to give them reasons to invest here in the UK, other than the domestic market demand. Competitive differentiation reasons to invest here in the UK, a friendly government, a welcoming government. One of the things we asked the government to do is change the rhetoric. You know, be amazed. You don't need to spend a lot more money. Just sound different. Sound as though you really want people to come and invest here and create jobs and growth for the UK. Makes a huge difference to boardrooms around the world. And that's a relatively cheap change, but it's got to be consistent. It's got to be sustained over time. It can't be a one-off. So this strategic relationship, an ongoing relationship, was what we created. And since then, I mean, it's just grown, it's flowered, it's blossomed. And as we work together, industry has a huge responsibility, and Vince, you heard me say this before, you can't leave it to government to develop an industrial strategy. We can complain about it as industrialists if we like, but we get what we deserve if all we do is complain. What we have to do is get our act together. Create collaborative forums where the different competitors in the sector can actually find they have a lot of common interests if they can only identify what they are and agree to work together on them. And then create an agenda working with government, but actually an industrially driven and defined agenda that creates jobs and growth. Because if you can create jobs and growth, you service the needs of all the stakeholders if you do it in a sustainable way. Not a one-off, sustainable competitive advantage to create those jobs and growth. So what's happened since then? Well, as others have alluded to, we have actually managed to turn things around. Now, part of this is because of the Automotive Council, if you like, the early days of what has now become the industrial strategy. It's being reinforced by what is now the industrial strategy in the automotive sector. But we have to also be honest, it's also because who was left standing after those 25 years of erosion were bloody good. They were lean, fit companies who'd survived all of the storms that had been coming their way. So we had a good, strong sector, but one that still needed a helping hand. And that helping hand didn't involve, quote, lots more money. It involved taking a look at the money we already spend as a government, taxpayers' money, and just figuring out more intelligent ways of spending it to get better returns, to be more helpful and more directed and more focused on the things that industry really needs to make a difference to those investment choices. So that's what we've been doing, and we've created, this last year we created 10,000 jobs instead of losing 10,000 jobs. We've attracted another £2.5 billion of investment on top of a previous £7 billion that's gone onto the industry. We're creating a significant increase in assembly capacity here in the UK. And finally, after many years of struggle, we're starting to see the supply chain picking up some of the benefits. And it's taken us a long time to get to this point, but gradually we're starting to see the supply chain opportunity here in the UK, which are very significant, start to pick up in the slipstream of this growth that the OEM assemblers are creating. And I should say it's not just about cars. It's mainly about cars from a scale point of view, but it's also about off-road vehicles, it's about commercial vehicles, and it's about construction and agriculture, and it's about motorsport. So it's quite a broad sector, and I would argue because of its sheer scale, exports are up by 17%, even in a time when the European economy has been quite weak in terms of car demand. And I would argue that the automotive sector is so large in scale, it's very difficult to have a viable manufacturing industry in a country unless you have a vibrant automotive sector. It feeds scale and expertise to across the whole of the industrial spectrum for manufacturing. So we're in a much better place than we were, and I think that not all of the credit belongs to the industrial strategy, but it would be wrong to say that a good deal of it can't be attached to the industrial strategy. And we look forward to, we're by no means satisfied or complacent. We think there's more growth yet to come by a long way. And we also know our competitors abroad are busy trying to figure out what we're doing right and emulate us. So if we stand still, they'll overtake us again. So we're very determined to build on this, I think, superb foundations that we've established with the government and refresh the strategy as we did in July last year, and create another round of continuous improvement and success in this industry, and create that reputational difference which we're now doing, that says that Britain is not a bad place to make cars or design cars. It's actually one of the best places to design cars, especially as we're really good in the UK at solving very difficult problems. We've got some of the best universities in the world. Okay, sometimes we get bored at the simple stuff, but when it comes really difficult, like getting down from 160 grams a kilometre to 40 grams a kilometre, that's when the Brits are at their best.
Thank you very much indeed. Absolutely fascinating on that. How does this compare internationally? Yeah.
Well, I'm just going to offer some examples from some work we've been doing in Cambridge with Sir Mike Gregory, who's hiding at the back of the room, reviewing different approaches to industrial strategy in different countries. Also benefit from the work of the OECD and Ken Warwick, who's here as well. So among all the sort of complexity of different policy initiatives and diversity, there are some very strong themes that emerge, which are entirely consistent, I think, with some of the ideas underpinning industrial strategy here in the UK. So you'll see a very strong emphasis on coordination across government, but also on the convening role of government and the opportunities of collaborative forum, as mentioned by Richard. You will also see an emphasis on, again, partnership between government and industry, and again, very much focused in the context of these competitive differentiation, as Richard said, in the context of the increasing importance and complexity of global value chains. You'll also see over and over again this emphasis on longer-term planning, longer-term stability is pervasive in all the debates internationally. Among these themes of planning and coordination and partnership, and the thing I want to talk about, I think there's also significant attention to the role of networks and institutions and cross-government coordination groups in order to provide a sort of more collaborative, more collective, more joined up contribution to partnership on industrial strategy. I feel I should say, of course, that in any discussion of examples internationally, they will be developed in a very specific national context. There will be different industrial structures and industrial strengths in different institutions. And so I'm not suggesting that any of these models can be readily or easily transferred to the UK, if at all. But I think they do still offer some principles, and if nothing else, it's worth understanding how other countries' systems work. So in the case of industrial networks, I think there is something very interesting going on about the potential to have a more collective contribution, a more bottom-up approach to understanding the longer-term strategic needs of industry. So you'll see things like in Germany, the Federation of German Industrial Research Associations, the AIF somehow. And they're a collection of a network of about 100 sector-based SME associations. They have about 50,000, 60,000 affiliate members. And in their sector groups, they collectively identify longer-term challenges to their competitiveness as SMEs and what the critical longer-term technical operational needs are. And they have their core activity is a government-funded, although matched by industry, collaborative R&D program addressing these longer-term needs. And again, the structure of the Federation allows, at least in principle, for the identification of cross-cutting needs across these different sectors. And they run these programs themselves. They have their own research centers. They also commission work at the Fraunhofers and universities and so on. And I think they identify topics which I think probably may not have been prioritized had you the larger multinationals dominating a partnership process. So it's very much specifically an SME approach. So I think there's something, again, they've been around for 60 years. They have a lot of learned competencies. They have a lot of earned trust. So it's not something necessarily you could transfer directly, but there's something about the principle of collective identification of longer term needs. And something, I guess, that it doesn't have to be a sort of an industry network. It could be, you see in other countries, professional engineering bodies or sometimes national academies providing this kind of partnership to identify longer term concerns. Following up on references to Catapult and the Aerospace Technology Institute and so on, one of the other interesting things is as industrial strategy-like initiatives introduce these new intermediate organizations, it's striking that they have very often in other countries perhaps more of a multiplicity of functions, a more diverse set of linkages. So for example, you'll find equivalent technology R&D type institutes will do their technology R&D, but they'll also be at the forefront of working on supply chain development activities, or they'll be working very closely on vocational skills development, or they'll work on standards, or they'll work on certification. And they have a much more broad set of connections to other aspects of industrial strategy and offer some sort of focus for coordination and joint uppiness within the system as well. Finally, I think just on cross-government coordination, I think internationally, a lot of the efforts in this area are focused around, in particular, emerging technologies in industry. People have put a lot of effort and attention. So you'll see interesting structures, for example, in the White House in the United States, various subcommittees of the National Science and Technology Council, which are charged with cross-government, cross-department, cross-agency coordination and alignment, especially around, and some of them around, key emerging technologies that will support emerging industries or key cross-cutting technologies. And they'll have this very specific coordination focus around and supervision or support of initiatives related to longer-term growth and employment. So, for example, one of the most sort of high-profile examples is the subcommittee around nanoscale engineering and technology, which plans and manages the budget and implements the National Nanotechnology Initiative. It's a very big initiative involving huge numbers of departments of energy and defense and agriculture and agencies like the National Science Foundation or the National Institute of Health and Standards and the Federal Drug Administration. So huge numbers of governments and agencies, and a big part of their planning process is a very systematic mapping of their different initiatives and their different activities and their different budget portfolios, looking for ways to reduce overlap and to refine a common agenda and do things more efficiently and in a more coherent way. Interestingly, I think they also, as a committee, oversee the budget supplement that goes with investment in nanotechnology-related R&D and other activities across these different departments and agencies. And I guess I'm somewhat speculating here, but that common single budget request, I think, does offer at least some opportunities for incentivizing coordination and exploitation of synergies. So just to wrap up, I think despite all the diversity of policy initiatives and the different economic challenges facing different countries and the different industrial structures, there are these common themes of partnership and coordination and longer-term planning and longer-term stability. And I think despite not necessarily any of those models or other models being directly transferable to the UK, I think that it is interesting to reflect on whether industrial strategy could take more advantage of the role of networks, of institutions, and some of these cross-departmental, cross-government coordinating committees to create a more collective, a more coherent, a more joined-up contribution to the partnership of industrial strategy.
Thank you very much indeed. Can we just take up that point, Vince? I mean, the degree to which, I mean, you referred in your opening remarks to working with various other departments. You listed 4 or 5 in particular, and you could easily double it in various ways. The degree to which the development of your strategy would be helped if there were more joint budgets between departments, more cross-cutting work in various areas.
Well, I mean, the starting point in our work is actually getting the industries together and the sectoral groups and the government working with them. And if we're dealing with, say, one of the energy supply chains, like offshore wind or nuclear or oil and gas, then DEC will be driving that with us, and Treasury will be involved because there are a lot of tax issues on energy. So they're involved in that kind of, in a kind of bespoke way. We don't have some overall supremos sitting at there's no kind of cabinet subcommittee overseeing the industrial strategy. It's dealt with case by case. But I report to the cabinet every few months, and we give them an update on both the cross-cutting work and the sector work, and it's an opportunity to chide colleagues who perhaps are less committed to this than others. So there is a very British mechanism for dealing with that.
Another issue is, in a sense, Richard raised it. There's always industrial strategy, but people don't necessarily use the name. And to extent, I mean, if you look back, and indeed when you were shadowing the post at various times in the past, Vince, is the degree to which there's an inherent danger in the British political system of reinvention. That even though there's consistency, and on the automotive sector there's been quite a lot of consistency. Peter Balanson was doing what you've been doing. There isn't a particular discontinuity there, just to pick up one sector amongst many. But the danger of rebranding and the disruptive effect that has.
Yes, I mean, I think there's one area where a great deal of well, damage, if you want to be critical, or transitional costs, if you want some more neutral phrase,
That's the type of phrase you use here.
has occurred, has been on the kind of spatial dimension.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the sector stuff works very well, and I think if there were a change of government, they would continue it. I don't see any problem with that. And I think the cross-cutting stuff on technology, on finance, business bank, I don't have any worry about that. The area which has been seriously disrupted was, I mean, we made a decision, an executive decision, to get rid of the RDAs, and there were pluses and minuses, and some people argued for a more gradualist approach, others for a Maoist approach, and we adopted the latter. And we've been trying to create from scratch a whole new institutional framework, the LEPs, and then superimposed on that city deals. It was all a bit messy, actually, and I'm not sure we've got it right, and I'm not equally, I don't know how much buy-in there is elsewhere from other parties. So I think a lot of the industrial strategy has got, is now durable, but there's that one area where there has been massive disruption, which is, and it goes back to this sort of bigger debate about regionalism, actually. That, we've got devolution to Scotland, which has got very strong institutions. The decision was made not to have English regions, but we had these RDAs that sort of people took against, and we've never really filled that. Unlike the Germans, have got a very good, clear federal system. It's been there forever, since the war, and it seems to work for them. We've never been able to decide in the UK how to organise ourselves geographically.
Richard,
That's very disruptive.
Yeah, Richard, taking up that point, because I mean, the motor industry was traditionally had a very strong regional concentration. It's now much more dispersed. In a sense, I mean, it's gone out of the West Midlands. It's not solely.
No, it's actually still pretty concentrated on 3 areas in the UK, maybe 4.
I was thinking how you define Swindon and places like that, but
Yeah.
but then does that spatial point echo with you that the absence of a larger tier than actually often quite small cities and pretty weak counties, does that affect your development strategy?
Well, we're very adaptable. We learned how to work with the RDAs, and we're quite deliberately and consciously building relationships with the LEPs in the areas where we have significant footprint. But I have to say that I think, I take a slightly broader point here. I think one of the risks where we always have to try to avoid when working in these areas is the desire to please everybody. I think it's very, very difficult, whether you're choosing technologies or whether you're choosing regions, that if you don't choose somebody, they feel excluded and they feel disadvantaged and they lobby against what you've decided not to give them. But actually, in what we're trying to do here to create competitive advantage and to really pay our way in the world, we have to make some tough decisions. Who is going to be the most successful at delivering this area of competitive advantage? And that might be a regional decision or it might be a technology decision, but you have to make some tough decisions. And I think that's one of the challenges when you talk about the spatial or regional dimension is resisting the temptation to spread the available resources thinly across all the candidates and achieve insufficient critical mass. And there's plenty of very good economic research, which you'll all be familiar with, on clustering theory, that clearly shows economic performance and growth rates in areas that attract this sort of critical mass of clustering significantly outperform the rest of the economy. So we just need to take the lesson, evidence-based policy, take the lesson learned, and accept clustering is really important, and therefore there should be a clustering spatial dimension to our sector industrial strategy. It will happen. The question is, can we accelerate it rather than resist it?
Okay.
Yeah, I think certainly a renewed interest in clustering mechanisms as you look at the new sort of industrial strategies in different countries. I think there's something interesting around. You see countries, smaller countries like Singapore, who know which bits of which value chains they're in and which bits of global value chains they're integrated in, can see much more clearly how they might nurture and cultivate supply chains in their smaller region, and use their smaller government to bring a very coherent approach to bringing together the sort of right combination of all of these different factors of technical competencies and finance and infrastructure and technology R&D in such a way as to differentiate themselves competitively in this context of global value chains. And I think there's something about regions, smart regions, being able to do that that's very compelling and seems very successful internationally.
Now, another point is the range of sectors you cover. I remember talking to someone in your department saying one of their biggest successes was resisting a sector, you having a policy on the sector.
Well, if that's the case, I've overridden them. I mean, I take a very pragmatic view about it. We chose 11 totally arbitrarily, but actually some of the most successful sector work is outside of it. We've got a very, very good creative industries group. They've discovered that there is such thing as creative industries. They've got common interests, and they work very effectively. We've got a group on the railways, which again is outside formally. The chemical industry, which was, had terrible kind of competing baronies, decided that they were getting left behind by the automotive sectors and others. So they've organised themselves now. We have a chemical industry group. They don't welcome too much government, but they're working more coherently. The area which we haven't managed to corral, if that's the right expression, are the big kind of what you might call the basic industries. You've got kind of cement, glass, steel, all those, which are actually massive problems. They've got energy cost problems, they've got spare capacity, all kinds of issues. And it's been very difficult to integrate them, and they don't the great deal of commonality between them. And that's a sort of bit of a leftover that we haven't
Yes, because that goes to the underlying point. In a sense, you picked 11 sectors, and I think the person I was talking to was actually glad you'd picked those sectors, and what he meant was not necessarily another one which didn't necessarily need it, perhaps. But what about new sectors coming up? How adaptable, and I'll ask all three of you, how adaptable can an industrial strategy be to the rapid pace of technological development? I mean, nano was mentioned classically. We wouldn't have had that discussion 10, 15 years ago. To new sectors, or is there inherently in government you're going to be behind the curve on that?
Well, as I've said, groups have come up spontaneously and said, we want to organise ourselves as a strategy group. We said, fine, okay, we'll provide you with a bit of resource and see what you can do. The really disruptive technology, of course, are in ICT, in information communication. We initially took the view, well, this is so disruptive, so unpredictable, and so dynamic, why on earth would we want to involve them in something like the car industry or the aerospace industry? But they actually Intellect, which is the trade body, and related, but said, yeah, we actually do want to sit down and think about this in a long-term strategic way, because we've got major problems around computer science, staffing and so on. So we do want to think about this collectively. But, they just do their own thing. We're not trying to plan them. And one of the interesting things that's happened, and is actually within the industrial strategy, but it just happens spontaneously, is you're now getting this so-called cluster of clusters approach, where we have this thing called Tech City around the East End of London, which initially was a very kind of London-centric phenomenon, but we've now got about 15 of these in places like Bristol, Dundee, Gateshead, Belfast, and they now work as a network, and we help to support them through the industrial strategy. But it's a very bottom-up process, and we certainly don't want to constrain it in any way.
Right. Now let's open it up for questions. We've got about 10 minutes or so. What I'll try and do is take clusters of questions. There's a mic around. Gentleman there. And could you say who you are?
Stephen Barber, London South Bank University. It struck me when you were talking about industrial short-termism that one idea that was very attractive to all parties before the general election, in fact found its way into the coalition agreement, was the idea of different business models, notably mutuals. And I wonder if that still remains central to some of these ideas.
Yeah, we'll take, and the second question, gentleman behind you there.
Ken Warwick, formerly of BIS, but now, as Owen kindly said, doing work with the OECD on industrial strategy. Seems to me what the UK is doing is very much in line with modern thinking on industrial strategy, and Owen covered that really well. But there are concerns that people express. One you've addressed, that you might freeze the industrial structure. There are also concerns about competition, about excluding SMEs, international trade concerns and so on. So can you say a bit about how you're addressing those dangers, and also what you're doing to get an independent evaluation of how successful all this is?
Right, I think that's about 3 questions itself. And the gentleman, yeah, Kenny's just in front of you. Yeah.
Hi, Fred Aziz Lorenzo from Pagefield Communications. I was at a talk the other day by the Food and Drink Federation, and they were saying that a lot of the rhetoric around industry concentrates on the sort of heavy industries, so automotive, steel, like you sort of discussed. And they said that one of the real problems they have is getting skills from sort of lesser industries like food manufacturing on the political agenda. Do you think, food manufacturing, for instance, is quite a dynamic industry and quite a big presence in England. Do you think there is a lack of attention on addressing sort of skills shortages in something like that? Do you think it's too focused on heavy industries at the expense of sort of other manufacturing?
Thank you. Let's take those 3. Yeah, do you want to?
Well, just on that final point, I think that's one of the advantages of potentially cultivating SME associations or industry associations in particular sectors that may feel they're neglected, to involve them more in the process, to be able to give them more skills and competencies, to understand the skills needs and maybe collectively make the case for it. I mean, there are some attractive models perhaps in Germany where they, as I said, they're running their own programs as institutions, but that will take a long time to cultivate an institution to be able to do that. But it's something as in terms of a long-term agenda that maybe you want to actually shape over time industry associations and give them extra competencies and work with them to do that. In terms of Ken's points, several points, again, I think there's the reviewing issue, how you evaluate the programs. I think, know from work with Ken, that's a very tricky process. In terms of individual bits of industrial strategy, again, it's striking. In some countries, you'll see, for example, national academies playing a role in reviewing aspects of technology aspects of industrial strategy. So again, I think there's aspects of being able to turn to other institutions to be part of the evaluation process. But it's a tricky thing to do.
Richard?
Yeah, just not sure that I would need a debate over a drink about whether automotive is a heavy industry.
A drink will be available in about 10 minutes.
Good, but I want to come back to the question raised about SMEs and how do we involve SMEs and make sure they're not excluded. I think automotive is a particularly difficult industry for SMEs to get into because the barriers to entry for a supply chain member into automotive are very high because of the scale of it and because of the very demanding quality and delivery schedule and logistic requirements. But we are also very conscious that perhaps on a very mature technology like an injection molded bumper, it's very hard to allow an SME or to find an SME who's got the ability to jump through those barriers to entry. But where the real opportunity exists is where there's disruption going on in the technology space. And there, of course, big companies don't have all the answers. In fact, big companies can't chase all the potential answers. They just don't have the resources. So what they do is they have to move to open innovation models. And what we've done with working with government is created mechanisms whereby the government money, which is basically a 50% subsidy to match the private investment, is only available if your partnership includes an SME, or at least one SME. So what we try and do is use the bait, if you like, of the money to create activity where tier one suppliers, OEMs, for institutions such as universities and SMEs come together and discover each other and find that there's a potential solution to the problem that the big company is looking for, but only available through working together with the SME. And this actually gives the SMEs the key, the beginnings of the key. I don't say they're necessarily all the key to start unlocking the door to the market access.
Right, thanks, Vince.
Well, to do with the first question, which is an important question for government, but I don't see it fitting within this framework. Maybe I'm not imaginative enough, but it's the mutual issue. I do care about mutuals. I had the Nationwide in my office this afternoon talking about financial regulation and challenger banking and all this kind of stuff. No, we do want to see mutual. The problem with the mutual sector, of course, is the terrible ghost of the co-op, which has done real serious reputational damage to mutuality. I'm hoping that Lord Miners' reforms will work, and it will get back into a credible shape. But the mutual movement is taking a big step backwards, unfortunately, with that. On the SMEs, that's absolutely right. There is a natural tendency for all our sector groups, for these organisations like the catapults, to attract the big OEMs. Our advanced manufacturing catapult, I guess the people who find their way to the door are Rolls-Royce, the car companies and so on. But they have, as part of their mandate, a specific objective of working with the SME community. And this SME thing, actually, I think we're getting more and more frustrated with it. It's increasingly meaningless. The core group of companies we're focusing on, I think, in many cases, are the 9,000, 10,000 companies that the CBI calls gazelles, the Germans call the Mittelstand, kind of medium-sized, 100, 200 employee. I mean, these are totally different animals from sole traders or micro companies. And so a lot of the work in the industrial strategy is about those companies. It's nothing to do with the sole traders and the startups. They've got their own dynamic. But we do need to involve. We have one particular initiative which got off to a bumpy start, is now working well, which we call AMSCI, the Advanced Manufacturing Supply Chain Initiative, which is about helping provide supply chain finance. By definition, these are supply chains led by an OEM, but with a whole lot of satellite companies, and we help to provide finance to develop their capacity. In terms of evaluation, well, maybe when a new government comes in, it would be a good thing to do, just to step back and say, is this working, is this right, do we need a slightly different angle on it? That would be a good discipline, I think. But at the moment, we do have an overarching body, which is led by Richard Lambert from the CPI, and various people of that calibre who meet from time to time and have an oversight of what we're doing and make constructive criticism. So it's not that it's just Whitehall and the big bosses sitting down together and sorting this out. We try to build in critical scrutiny as we go along. And finally, the point about heavy industry. Well, actually, amongst the 11 sectors, there are some that will surprise you. Apart from the ICT, the information communications, we've got professional services is one of them. Now, the rationale is that, why have we picked these sectors, which is, of course, it is fluid and we're pragmatic. That what characterises them is that they are tradable. We're trying to, the underlying rebalancing of the economy is an attempt to move resources into tradable goods and services. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do, to exports and import substitution. And if they're, car industry is an obvious one, but professional and business services are another. And their long-term strategic issues are not the same, but they have an interest in sitting down with us and talking about training and about immigration policy. That's their big beef. And it provides a forum to enable them to do it.
Thank you. We've got time for a very quick round of questions. David.
You mentioned the question of coordination across government, and you said we had a very British mechanism for doing it. That seemed to be certainly true. It seemed to be in one area it didn't work when we were in government, and I'm not certain we've made much progress, and that is on the question of procurement. Yeah. And a particular area is ICT, where I think government actually procures an enormous proportion of ICT across the government, something like 25%. It seems to me you'll never get that right unless you have some kind of central resource in government which can look at the whole ICT procurement and not necessarily do it, but actually make certain that that procurement process across government really works to stimulate the industry, because there is enormous capacity, it seems to me, to improve and support the ICT industry in that way.
Right, and lady back there. Yeah.
Sorry, mine's just a slightly different question. I just wanted to ask what is the long-term strategy for creative industries that are also bringing a lot of income and support? What training, what support is there for the future for them? It kind of links with your question earlier about the feed industry. And
Right, and the final one from this lady here. Yep.
Brunella Longo, Information Management Advisor and Freelance Consultant. I'm one of the sole trader you tend to dismiss, sorry for saying that, and I anticipated many of the things you said. I'm now working, pushing proposal here and there. Everything is being rejected. So I'm definitely in a long-term tunnel, I would say. I believe in what I'm proposing.
We haven't got much time for questions.
But the question is, how long do I have to wait to see the stuff you mentioned addressed properly? Because it's absolutely not true, in my view, that in a digital economy, that is the infrastructure of all the other sectors you mentioned, stuff happens.
Okay, your point. Thanks.
Is a clear question?
No. Thanks. We've got to move on. Thank you.
Okay.
Vince.
Well, on David's point, procurement, as you know, the Cabinet Office tries to exercise that role, and it has a quite a strong view on how you deal with ICT. And the problem is with procurement, as you'll know from being a government, we're often trying to pursue different objectives at the same time, right? You're trying to get the lowest cost, you're trying to deal with, building up supply chains, you're trying to make sure that procurement is linked to training, you're trying to ensure that the small companies get their share. So, it's getting a sensible metric that actually reconciles these different objectives. But given this government's financial problems, it's often price which is driving all the others. But it's basically Francis Maud and his team in the Cabinet Office who do have a coordinated approach to it. On creative industries, we've made a lot of progress with the creative industries. We've got a very good Creative Industries Council, which is a bit analogous to the automotive sector. We have somebody called Nicola Mendelsohn from, I think, the games sector who chairs it. But we have, a typical meeting will have the leading people from the television companies, from the film industry, from architecture, music, big industry for the UK. And what we've established is that there are some generic problems. A lot of these companies, copyright is a big generic problem. We've been reforming copyright in quite a radical way. Another generic problem is access to finance, because most of these companies don't have property and they don't have, fixed assets, so banks won't lend to them. There is a very, very serious problem there, so we're trying to work with the banks to find ways of making sure that that companies that trade on intellectual property rather than tangible property can get access to credit. And we've developed all kind of training processes for them. There is a specialist body called SkillNet that operates in the creative industry sector, and we're trying to support them. So the creative industries does get quite a lot of attention, and it is an area where Britain has a very strong comparative advantage, actually. On just a final point on sole traders, I don't want in any sense to minimise their importance. We do have a rapid growth of startups in the UK at the moment. A lot of companies starting. The question is how you sustain them. We have the startup loan scheme, which you may have happened, is expanding very, very rapidly indeed. For companies under 10 people. Digital infrastructure, well, you can make your own judgments, but advanced digital infrastructure is being rolled out in most parts of the country. Fast high-speed broadband is now available in most parts of the country.
Brief final word? Yeah.
Maybe just one more on an aspect of procurement. Someone mentioned earlier how you might collectively encourage emerging industries. There's something about the specialist technology, advanced technology procurement that comes out of ministries of defence and health and so on that can tackle manufacturing issues and characterization test issues and standards issues, which do actually, through technical procurement, pull through some important emerging technologies into real industries.
Richard, briefly?
Yeah, one of the big challenges we have is we have these great universities, great intellectual capital, but we're not very good at jumping across the sort of valley of death between You know, doing small-scale work in a laboratory is brilliant, world-leading, and getting traction at scale. And one of the roles of the catapults that we talked about earlier, which is perhaps overlooked or perhaps not well known, is they're specifically designed to address that problem, to de-risk the investment in the risky bit of getting out of the lab and beginning to prove out in production reliable delivery of affordable product. And that's really a really important role of the catapults in this country, which is actually really important for Britain because we've got some of the best universities and we're one of the poorest at exploiting that intellectual capital.
Well, thank you. We've had an absolutely fascinating hour. My apologies to those who didn't have an opportunity to ask questions. It was just a matter of time. We'll be pursuing many of the themes at later events. And I'd like to thank Ewan, Richard, and Vince Cable for sparing the time, a time when he's extremely busy with a number of contentious issues, for his candour and for his reflections, because they set the issues in a very interesting context. And we'll be following that up. I also like to thank the City Corporation for their sponsorship of this series. The second series we've been involved with them, and I look forward to their further involvement on that. So could you join me in thanking the panel for that?